our last chapter and in our last set of lectures, we talked a lot about how societal forces shape foreign policies. And what we want to do now is go back inside the government and really talk about how decision-making in the government shapes foreign policy. And we're going to talk a lot about what we call decision-making, or today we're going to really focus on perception and misperception. And in doing that, we begin with something that's known as the two-step model. And essentially, this gets at the question of does perception and misperception shape foreign policy in significant ways? In other words, we're beginning with at least a little bit of skepticism as to whether this is something we even need to be talking about. And of course, if we thought the answer was no, I'd skip it altogether. So you kind of know where we're headed. But I want to focus in on this just a little bit. And in order to do that, we use this so-called two-step model that Robert Jervis, who's a famous scholar of international politics and really does a lot of stuff on psychology and international politics, used to teach over at UCLA. He basically argued in a famous book that was published in 1976 that in order for us to say that perception matters in foreign policy, two things both must be true, right? Not one or the other, but they both have to be true. And it's sort of logical, but I think it's worth us thinking about. The first is the decision maker. So we're typically talking about a president or a prime minister, somebody like this. But most of what we're going to say about this actually applies to each of us as individual decision makers. The first condition is that the decision maker's got to have some range of options to choose from. In other words, if the leader is very tightly constrained either by external forces that really give them no range of options, or by internal factors, well, then it doesn't matter what they think, because regardless of what they think, they're going to do the same thing, right? So, for example, a good example of this is fairly recently in this country. President Trump seemed to be pretty skeptical, pretty actually opposed to enacting new sanctions against Russia. But it really didn't matter what he thought, because he was constrained domestically, because it was one of the few things that Democrats and Republicans in the Congress agreed upon. And so they basically passed sanctions with very large majorities. They could have overridden a veto if they wanted to. And so it didn't matter what Trump thought. So we didn't really need to take his thinking into account. The flip side of that is, if you think back to the crisis over the Syrian civil war, when Obama was president, Congress was kind of divided over whether we should get involved or not. And with Congress divided, Obama could have chosen either way. And so therefore you had to ask, how does he see the situation? And so his perception of the situation became more important. The second condition is that it must be the case that different people perceive the situation differently. So to go back to my previous example, even if Congress, even if Obama weren't constrained by Congress, if everybody agreed on what to do, then there's really very little chance that his particular individual perception is going to matter. So if everybody sees things the same way, then there's really no variation, and it doesn't matter if the individual has a lot of latitude or not, right? So for example, again, another recent example, if everybody agrees that Russia hacked U.S. computers, the only debate is what to do about it, right? So the perception about whether Russia did this or not becomes irrelevant because everybody agrees on what happened. Now, that doesn't mean it's true. In this case, it is true. But even when everybody agrees on something and they're all wrong, right, that perception really isn't much of a variable, although we still want to explain, well, why was everybody wrong, right? So again, just to give the counterexample, in 2002, 2003, people disagreed a great deal about whether Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, so George W. Bush's perception mattered a great deal. So we might want to ask the question then, if both conditions have to be met for perception to matter, how often is that true? Jervis argues, and I think this is a pretty reasonable position, I don't think anybody's ever really disagreed too strongly about this, that the answer is often but not always, as some of the examples I've provided have already shown. So again, just to give another example that's discussed at some length in the textbook, the decision to try to kill Osama bin Laden was an interesting one. President Obama had the latitude to order a mission, or he could have decided not. So he did have some range of freedom of decision, and there was a lot of disagreement about what to do. There was disagreement about whether Osama bin Laden was actually in the place in Pakistan they thought he was, whether the U.S. could successfully attack, and what was the danger that things might go badly. Now, interestingly enough, what there was not any disagreement about was whether was the idea that the U.S. wanted to go find the guy and kill him if possible. This has actually come up, been given attention recently. Apparently, Joe Biden was one of the ones who argued caution in that particular case. So one of the questions we want to ask is, how does the two-step model apply to other cases that we're familiar with? You can all do this on your own. You can think about all kinds of questions. I've used mostly American examples, but we're going to talk a bunch about World War I as well as the Russian side of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But you can apply this in a lot of places. Did the actor have latitude to make different decisions? And was there actually some variation in how people saw the situation? Those are the two things that we have to identify before we can say that their perception or their misperception really shaped outcomes. And so that's a brief start, but it's an important start to this discussion.